Thanks, Lisa. Very nice, mostly untrue, but appreciated just the same. So this comes from the back of the program of the three speakers here. And here's what I want you to notice. So there's Jeff with his ski cap on in the Antarctica. And there's James, on the glacier in Greenland. There's me in a library in Palm Beach. And the books behind are the social register of Palm Beach. Now, I can assure you that I'm not, and I don't even have bone spurs to make excuses for what. Anyway, I'm not one of those guys. What I am is a one-trick pony. I never get to go anyplace where somebody says, yeah, didn't I hear you talking about this exact same thing like here 6 years ago or something? And yes, you did. My whole career has been saying, oh, historic preservation. So I'm like 142 years old, and every year I've been doing something about that. But I promise you, for those of you who have had to sit through this preservation economic stuff before, there is some stuff new, and I'm going to try to share that with you. Again, we do analytical stuff about the impact of preservation. And I'm going to give you a bunch of factoids about what we've learned, because that is really what is at risk. And property values are a big deal, and that's what we've heard about, and that's certainly one of them, but it's not at all the only one of these impacts. A couple of months ago, we released a study of the state tax credit, historic tax credit in the state of Pennsylvania. And we had, I'd gone up there to Harrisburg to give a little preview of our findings a few months earlier, and the next day I got an email from a guy who was in the audience, and he said, I enjoyed your short presentation at Preservation PA the other afternoon. It was as interesting as the topic would allow. So I fessed up to that. I put that on Facebook, and the next day I got a suggestion from a friend of mine on kind of how to beef it up, and so I tried. But for today, this is going to seem like the eternal economics seminar, and I just apologize, so you're free to doze off, and I'm certainly understanding of that. So we have, in recent years, done a number of preservation impact studies, a large number of which have been on the city level. And a lot of the stuff that we learn is what's called, in kind of economics geek term, revealed preference. And so I know that you all wanted me to explain it in mathematical terms, which maybe I could do, but there's another way to think about revealed preference, is that we could have somebody come in here with a tray of ice cream cones, some of them chocolate and some of them vanilla, and you would all choose one or the other. Now, I could simply ask how many prefer chocolate, how many prefer vanilla, and you'll raise your hand, and that's stated preference. But we can also just see how many people took the chocolate one, how many people took the vanilla one, and that's revealed preference. And so much of what you'll see, our findings, is based on what the marketplace is saying about historic buildings and historic neighborhoods. So for, I don't know, almost 20 years, there have been a number of statewide studies on the economics of preservation. My firm has done some of them, others have done them, but mostly they've been on the statewide level. Well, I wish I could say it's because I'm so smart, but it's absolutely not. It's because we've had clients at the local level who said, yeah, we got that statewide study. Yeah, our state had one a couple years ago, but really, we need to know what it is on the local level. And there's really kind of good reasons for that. You get rid of that, well, yeah, that might be the state of Texas, but it's not San Antonio. You get rid of that, but that's not here argument. There's a point of reference that people get when you talk about a neighborhood. People say, oh, yeah, I live there, or I know that neighborhood. Politicians can see the direct impact of preservation in the city that they are governing. It's an opportunity to tap local expertise. We can do all the data research we want, but we'll never have the kind of nuanced understanding that local experts will have, and we tap that. And then, not unlike what Lisa did in the survey with you, then you can start to put the whole preservation strategy into a context of consensus in the local community, and then it can be used for implementation. And as you all know, but Lisa pointed out when she talked about the difference between National Register districts and local districts, in America, it's kind of a bizarre thing, but in America, the protection for historic resources comes at the local level. You can have a National Historic Landmark building, and if you're a private owner, you can tear it down tomorrow. Nobody's going to stop you from doing that unless there's a local protection, which is then I was just kind of slow in figuring it out, but clients did. That's why we've been looking at the local level, and so most of the geeky charts and graphs I'm going to show you are from this kind of local level of historic districts. Well, back to these statewide studies. Well, I don't know, maybe 30 states have had statewide studies over the last 20 years, and whether we did them or someone else did, the kind of big four that have emerged in most of those are these. The jobs and household income created simply by the fact of rehabilitating old stuff. The impact of heritage tourism, the differential impact of heritage tourism versus tourism in general, the downtown revitalization and the role that preservation plays in that, and importantly, the role of local historic districts on property values. Those are kind of the big four everybody looked at and found some interesting stuff. And again, we haven't abandoned those. We've looked at them as well. And so, for example, in the Pennsylvania tax credit study. So we looked at what happens when somebody invests $1 million rehabilitating a historic building in the state of Pennsylvania. And there is jobs, 6.5 direct jobs and 5.5 indirect jobs, and there's income of almost $400,000 or $61,000 a job being generated, or $290,000 in indirect activity. And when that $1 million is spent, invested in that historic building, ultimately that generates another $800,000 someplace else in the state's economy. And so we looked in Pennsylvania about, I just Googled what the biggest industries are in Pennsylvania and said, all right, in terms of output from each of those industries, what do they mean in terms of jobs and household income generated? So we looked at historic rehab versus food processing, natural gas industries, fabricated metals, medical devices, chemical manufacturing, drugs and pharmaceuticals. In every one of those, the same amount of economic output in fact, generates more numbers of jobs and a greater paycheck, total paycheck for people in Pennsylvania than does any of those leading industries. So it really, you can like gargoyles and cornices all you like, but really fundamentally it's a strong economic driver in a local community. So what it's meant is the state tax credit there in Pennsylvania, 821 projects, $2.7 billion with a B dollars invested every year. While there's volatility, it goes up and down. 1,700 jobs generated by the use of the tax credit, and $100 million in labor income, pockets in the people of workers in that state. So it's a big economic driver. So that's the first one. The second one traditionally is the role of downtown revitalization. What role does preservation, historic buildings play in overall downtown revitalization efforts? Most of that in the past in these statewide studies has come from Main Street numbers. And you all know Main Street is a program of downtown revitalization in the context of historic preservation. There's 2,500 Main Street communities, active communities around the country, and Main Street has kept those numbers. So that's one way of doing it, but in fact, when we've looked at the city level, we've found other ones. Raleigh, North Carolina, the capital of North Carolina, but also in the midst of 5 or 6 really world-class universities and the Research Triangle. So it is a booming place in downtown Raleigh. But in fact, almost half of the businesses that relocated, small guys who went into downtown Raleigh, in fact, didn't go in the glass towers. They went in historic buildings, and another 20% went into older buildings that just haven't been designated yet. Here is San Antonio. The purple areas are local historic districts in San Antonio, and the green dots represent a number of jobs in small firms. The bigger the circle, the higher the number of jobs. And it's not that they're all in the historic districts, but you can see that kind of natural attraction. There's a market expressing its preference, revealed preference to be in or near those historic downtown neighborhoods in San Antonio. Here is Savannah. and about 30% of all jobs in Savannah are in the historic district there. But a greater share of small firm jobs, an even greater share of startup jobs choose to be in those historic districts. Now, what does this have to do with sea level rise? Well, it's not just the property values. It is all of these things that are placed in risk when those historic resources are placed at risk. We've heard about GIS this morning, and a lot of our stuff is GIS. I don't even know what the hell GIS stands for, but I got a bunch of really smart young people who do, and they're also smart about kind of casting wide for new ways to look at things. And one of the things we've started doing is looking at Yelp reviews. So in Raleigh, this fast-growing city, we looked at the top 20 restaurants in the Yelp reviews. Well, over half, or nearly half of them, were in fact in historic buildings in Raleigh. Here again is Louisiana Main Street, a study that we just finished. Not a rich state at all. Most of the Louisiana Main Street communities are small and rural areas and not wealthy areas. But in fact, in the years of those programs, almost $1 billion of investment in those Main Street communities in Louisiana. Then this issue about property values. And it's really interesting. I've been at this forever. But 30 years ago, if somebody was saying, we want to create a local historic district, the real estate community, and I'm not against, that's the world I come from, but the real estate community would say, we don't want those stupid historic districts because another layer of regulation means prima facie it's going to hurt property values, you can't be lowering my property values, so no, we're against that. Now, that's the one area that's been studied by more people in different parts of the country, different methodologies than any other in this preservation economics thing. Now those same human beings are saying, we don't want that stupid historic district because it's going to make my property taxes go up because the values are going to go up in the rest of the state. Same humans, 180-degree different argument, again, just to say they don't want nobody telling them nothing. But anyway, we've looked at it, and for this section for here, we finished recently a study in Saratoga Springs, New York, that was almost exclusively focused on local historic districts and property values. And I think there's lots of similarities between Saratoga Springs and Nantucket. It's a little bigger, it's 28,000 instead of 17,000, but a significant amount of wealth, lots of second homes in New York, lots of seasonality in the visitation. So I think, and great historic resources. So I think there are some parallels, but we sorted the data every way that we could in Saratoga Springs. We looked at this issue of property values and local historic districts. So you can look at the value by age. And what we did is say, here's what's true of properties in local historic districts, regulated historic districts. Here's what's true in the rest of the city. So you can look at age. Well, every age cohort, in fact, the values of the same houses, same age, in historic districts are greater than in the rest of the city. We looked in the change of value over time. And for those of you who are math geeky kind, we looked at both the mean and the median. When you have one really, really, really expensive house, it can kind of skew the data. So we looked in both directions. In both the mean and the media, in every local historic district, they outperformed the city as a whole. We looked at condition. It didn't matter if the house was rated in excellent condition or normal condition or good condition. Ones in historic district were more valuable than those not. We looked by architectural style. The kind of predominant historic architectural style in Saratoga Springs is Victorian. So people who like Victorian houses, but they're paying bigger premium for Victorian houses in historic districts. Now, some of you serve on local preservation commissions, and I hate to tell you this, but this premium is not being paid because they love appearing before your goofy commission. They're paying a premium for the confidence that the lunatic across the street can't be doing something to his house that has an adverse impact on the value of mine. And then we just said, all right, forget all of that stuff. Just what's the norm of the house in Saratoga Springs? Well, it turns out it's a 3-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms. So we looked at those. And again, those in historic districts more valuable than those in the rest of the city. So this is just a consistent pattern, and I think that there are parallels there to here. And then the issue about heritage tourism. And again, I know this is something you have nominal interest of in Nantucket. So here's San Antonio, home of the Alamo, and you probably know that 3 years ago they got the missions, 9 or 10 of them in San Antonio on the UNESCO World Heritage List. So they have lots of visitation. And we looked at people who came to San Antonio who were interested, who went to historic sites, and those who came to San Antonio and said, yeah, I don't care about that stuff. Okay. And we looked at every way we could. A couple things about this. First of all, as a general rule, 60% of the daily expenditures of a tourist are going to be wherever they stay overnight. And so the day visitors or the night visitors have a much larger impact on the local economy than do day visitors. But it didn't matter in San Antonio. In fact, both the day visitors and the night visitors that were heritage visitors had a greater impact. In tourism, when you're a tourist, you spend your money in 5 areas. You spend it on lodging, you spend it on food and drink, you spend it on local transportation. That excludes the airline ticket or the ferry ticket to get there, because those aren't local expenditures. You spend it on admissions or entertainment, whatever, and you spend it on retail purchases. It's not just that the heritage visitors spend more in total, is they spend more in every one of those areas than do visitors who don't have that care. And this is a consistent finding. New York City, and this is just the domestic, not including international visitors to New York City. In fact, $738 million worth of tax revenues for the city of New York from just the heritage share of the domestic visitors to New York. We did a statewide study released about a year ago in Rhode Island. And of course, they have a wonderful, mostly summer tourism industry, driven, they're the ocean state after all, so lots of it's driven by beach activity. And what did people do? Well, what everybody does when you go on vacation is buy stuff. So shopping is number one, no surprise there. Second, fine dining. Gotta be closer to the mic. Thanks. Second, not surprising, was fine dining, but in the state of Rhode Island, is that 16 of the top 25 fine dining places were, and throughout the state, in fact, were in historic buildings. And then, people going to beaches, not surprising, it's a beach place, and then the next thing that they did, they went to historic sites. Every other activity in Rhode Island, in fact, were lesser activities than that. And then in overall, what the heritage portion of the tourism in a small state like Rhode Island, the heritage portion of that meant almost $1.4 billion of economic activity in that state. Some of you are involved in historic sites. And lots of times, here's your deal. You have to go to the city council in November saying, we don't have enough money to pay the heat bill this month. Can you help us out? And some city council members say, you guys don't even generate enough money in your admissions to pay your annual cost. What the hell are we giving you money for? Well, this is the reason. This comes from I stole it from a study that was done in Norway. So, I want to look at that here. And so we looked in Utah. And Utah has Salt Lake City, lots of stuff there, and that's a major place. But there's small towns in a big state, small towns all over that'll have one historic site or 2 small historic sites. And so we looked at the patterns there. And those are the people who are stuck in a house museum or a little historic site, struggling to make ends meet. But here's what we discovered that's absolutely consistent now every place we've looked. That while the historic site might have been the place that drew the visitor, it was the magnet. They weren't the ones that got the money. Those historic sites only got 7% of that visitor's money. 93% of it went to gas stations, hotels, restaurants, retail shops. It was the historic site that drew them. But it's like when Target has toasters on sale and they're selling you the toaster for less than they paid for it. That's to get you in the door. Well, that's really what many places in smaller places, historic sites do, is get them in the door so the rest of the community's economy benefits from that. Well, those are the big 4. Property, impact of property values, jobs and household income, downtown revitalization, and heritage tourism. Well, here's the new 10. And again, it's possible to look at because of what we heard about this morning about the availability of big data. And in my case, because I get young people that figure out how to do that stuff. And so I'm just going to give you some quick factoids about a bunch of these. So here we had a once in 2 generation financial crisis in America, where millions and millions of people lost everything. Millions of people lost everything they had because of the of the real estate recession. So we have looked at the patterns of foreclosure now in 40 or 45 cities with exactly the same answer every place, is that the rate of foreclosure in historic districts was decidedly less and usually averages about half of what it was in the rest of the city. It is not that people who live in historic districts never get divorced, never get fired, never run their credit card bill up too much. I think is what we're seeing is if I get in financial trouble, because even in weak markets, there's a latent demand for those historic properties, I can get somebody to buy it before I reach the foreclosure process. Somebody should be paying attention. HUD, the Mortgage Bankers Association, National Association of Realtors, huge deal, huge, not a statistical fluke. It happens every place, and we ought to be paying attention. By the way, the wealth of the neighborhood is not the variable. It was true in rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. It wasn't just, only rich people live in historic neighborhoods so they could cash a CD to make the mortgage payment. No, didn't matter. Income of the neighborhood was not the variable. Here is City of Raleigh, where almost 1 in 10 properties faced foreclosure action in the 3 years of the real estate recession. National Register districts, half of that. Local districts, half of that. Huge statistical difference. Here is San Antonio. There's a couple of neighborhoods, King William, that's a pretty wealthy neighborhood, but most of them are not. Didn't matter. Every one of them had lower foreclosure rates, every one of the local districts, than did the city as a whole. And kind of related is this issue of value stability on the downside. This is Savannah, and this is in the upmarket. Look at the dates. Here we had from 99 to 2008. If you'll recall those, if you're too young to remember this, I hate you. I just hate young, so I just get that out of the way. But we had 10 years, a decade of kind of ridiculously rates of appreciation in real estate. And then we had a crash. And so this was in the upmarket. And so what happened? Well, in the upmarket, historic properties did better. Then we had a real estate crash. We had a down market. In the down market, not that properties, some places didn't go down that were historic districts, but the rate was slower, took place later, recovery was sooner, a greater share of recovery. So better in the upside, better in the downside. Then this issue about density. Density is a weird thing because a whole bunch of people say we got to have more density. Public transportation advocates, people who have to pay for infrastructure, traffic control, all kinds of people say we got to have more density. Everybody likes density except citizens. They'll say, I don't want density. If I want density, I'd move to Manhattan. Okay, just chill on that thought for a minute. And what's interesting is if when, like the visual preference survey that you did on the sites here, we had a public group and we said, what kind of neighborhoods would you like to live in? Whether they live in historic neighborhoods or not, people will respond, yeah, that's the kind of neighborhood that I like to live in. They'll point to this one's a historic neighborhood. Well, I might not want to live in that neighborhood, but that's the kind of neighborhood because I don't want that density stuff. Okay, so Raleigh, North Carolina. At the beginning of the 20th century, they had a density, people per square mile, of almost 8,000 people. Then came the automobile and transportation and sprawl and suburbs, and it declined a lot. And so by 2013, they were up to about, 2,800 people per square mile. So there was the shift, and there's the Raleigh stats, is that the city as a whole has 2,500 people per square mile. The local historic districts, a density of twice that amount. And it's not because there's 40-story condos. It's the nature of those historic neighborhoods. And again, be true here in Nantucket as well. I have a brilliant young woman, Bree Grosicki, who works for me, and she worked in the study with me, and I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find 2 neighborhoods that are the same size, but that one of them is a new neighborhood and one of them is an old neighborhood. And I just want to make some comparisons. So she did. So here was Oakwood, it's a historic neighborhood, and Reedham Oaks, Wyndham, which is a relatively new subdivision. So 1,600, 1,700 people live in the historic district, 500 in the new subdivision. Size, 114 acres of both, the same size of neighborhoods. 800 housing units in Oakwood, 127 in the new subdivision. The average age, 1925 versus 1992. So you got it. Those are the two things. So we start making the comparisons in those two neighborhoods. So average size, 2,500 square feet in the historic neighborhood, 35. Well, that's no criticism there. Some people want a bigger house. That's okay. Value, 315,000 versus 524,000. And this is where a city's finance guy will get a little premature in his conclusion. Say, yeah, that's why we like those new subdivisions, because we get ad valorem property tax and the values. Okay, just chill for a minute, Mr. Finance guy. Taxes per unit, 2,800 versus 4,800. And then he says, see, I told you. We get, okay, just one more minute. And then the population per acre, 14.5 people per acre, and then versus 4.5 per acre. Now, a developer can pay for the initial roads. But roads and streets, when they're put in, they're going to have to be maintained forever, and that's going to be a taxpayer's expense. So the square feet of road per housing unit, 1,000 in the historic district, 2,200. Taxes per acre, 22,000 per acre in the historic district versus 5,000 in the new subdivision. Sooner or later, we're going to have to replace water and sewer line. The per acre cost for replacement is per unit cost per acre of replacing water and sewer, 8,800 in the historic district, 25,000 in the new subdivision. And taxes generated from the subdivision, 2.3 million in the historic district, 610,000. Who is contributing to the economic health of Raleigh? Well, it's that very dense historic district and its density, that it's the human scale that people like. Well, in New York City, the Real Estate Board of New York has been on a tear to weaken historic districts in New York, and their argument, the first four pieces of it, are absolutely correct. They say, number one, we're growing in population. That's true. Number two, we're fixed in boundaries. We can't grow, we can't go out. True. Number three is, if we're growing in population and we can't grow out, we have to grow up. True. They're right on all three of those counts. And then four, so we got to weaken those historic districts because they're keeping us from building the giant high-rises. That's where the argument falls short. So we looked at all of the residential high-rises over 500 meters built in Manhattan since 2001. And we took the census, the lowest census unit, and looked at the population in that census group before and after the construction. And they did what they said they would do. They added to density. The density there was before about 9,700 people per square mile. Then it went up to 104. So they added huge amounts of density, except that the historic districts in Manhattan were already more dense than that. Already, the historic district. So if you have to add density for God's sake. But you don't have to be doing it in the places that are already the densest in the city. And by the way, this pattern, while the numbers are different, this pattern is true in all five of New York City boroughs. Then there's this issue of walkability. Again, it's been signed on by planners and by public health people, all kinds of people saying, yeah, walkability. So it's one of the measures we begin just automatically taken. Here again is Raleigh. That and if, I think you all know, but if you don't, there's a thing called walkscore.com. You can go on there, type in any address in America, and they'll give you a walk score from 1 to 100. And the higher the number, the more walkable it is. You can quibble about if they have exactly the right variables, but at least it's a good indicator of the walkability on the neighborhood level. City of Raleigh is not a walkable place. It has a score of 29. It's automobile dependent. The local historic districts, walk scores of 82. And then here is Saratoga Springs. City as a whole, not bad. Walk score of 45 in the local historic districts in Saratoga Springs, 83 walk score. So here's all these people saying, hey, we got to have walkable neighborhoods. Well, yeah, that's why we have to make sure that we're keeping our historic neighborhoods, because they are the most walkable in most communities. Then this issue about knowledge in creative industries. Some of you have read Richard Florida. He's a guy that's 70% brilliant and 30% is head in a dark place, but he has some kind of interesting things to say. We've kind of broadened his creative class stuff to think about, let's talk about workers in the kind of knowledge fields as well, and look at it in as many ways as possible. So here again is Savannah. Again, 30% of all jobs, but in these knowledge categories, knowledge worker categories, greater propensity to be in historic districts. Here is the city of New York. You can like New York, you can hate New York, but nobody can say it's not one of or the most creative city in the world. Certainly is. You know, something like 8% of all jobs are in historic districts in New York. 20% of jobs in the most creative arts, entertainment, and recreation classes. Market preference, revealed preference of the marketplace to be in those neighborhoods that in fact are the nurturer of that whole creative industries. The federal government does some things good, some things bad, but one of the things that they do well is keep track every year of the numbers of businesses that open versus the number of businesses that close. All right? And the typical, over year after year, the kind of norm, the rates will be something between 1.1 and 1.2 to 1. That is 11 or 12 businesses open for every 10 that close, kind of on the long haul. And obviously, if you're going to have a growing economy, you have to have more businesses open than close. So we've tracked that on the national level. So here is for about an 8-year period what was happening in the nation. So you look at up to 2007, and they're kind of normal rates, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 to 1 of businesses opening to closing. And then the recession started at the end of 2007, and then you see 2008, 2009, 2010, a ratio of less than 1, meaning more businesses were closing than opening. And then it kind of slowly recovers by the end of the recession. That's what happened in the country. And now we've looked at, I don't know, 5 or 6 states, but I'll give you the data from 3 of them. We looked at what was happening in Main Street communities in states over that time. And there's what was happening. Even in the depths of the recession, those communities that had Main Street programs, that is economic development in the context of historic preservation, even in the worst, and in weak economies, they did better than the U.S. average in terms of keeping people in business so they're not closing and attracting new businesses in the worst of times. Historic districts are job attractors. And again, here is, we think of New York as a really expensive place, and it is. And young firms have to pay attention to cost. But there's still a market preference of young businesses and startup firms to be in historic district. Here's again Saratoga Springs. Again, a preference of small businesses and startup businesses to be in the historic districts. The marketplace is speaking. And then you're not obligated to concur with what maybe is a political perspective on our part, but we think that at the neighborhood level, that there ought to be, that a neighborhood, a healthy neighborhood ought to be a kind of demographic mirror of the community. That there ought to be a kind of representational within a neighborhood. We just think it's healthy for cities. So that's an issue that we looked at a lot in historic neighborhoods. So here is San Antonio, and this is of the income categories, and you can see that the lines are nearly parallel of people who are in historic districts and not in historic districts based on income groups. The only place where there's a significant skew is there's more of the poorest and more of the wealthiest in historic districts. Well, we'd argue that's kind of a good thing, in fact, to happen. That's San Antonio. Here is, we just released last week a study in Nashville, very rapidly growing city that has all kinds of issues. And so we broke down household income categories by 50,000 and under, by 50,000 to 100, and about the median household incomes about 74 or something, so it's kind of the mid group, and then household incomes greater than 100. Virtually a third of each of those income groups in local historic districts in Nashville. Here is by race in San Antonio. And again, kind of who by race lives where is, virtually the same in historic districts of the rest of the city. But the only trouble here is there's a relatively small African-American population in San Antonio, only about less than 7%. But what's important, demographically in San Antonio is Hispanic population, which again, the share of Hispanic population in San Antonio who lives in historic districts is nearly the same as share of the population that's Hispanic that lives in the city as a whole. This neighborhood as mirror of the city. Here is Rhode Island, and the numbers are so close, I thought, well, we had to check them twice because I thought people think we were lying. The numbers were kind of statistically parallel. So this is income groups, and they're statewide. in Rhode Island, income groups on whether they live in or not in a historic district. Again, they're the same spread of numbers. By race in Rhode Island, same answer, is that who lives in historic districts is who lives in the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island, as you probably know, is a state that really has had virtually no population growth in the last decade. But the one group that has grown in numbers in Rhode Island is the Hispanic population. And what's happened? Well, the Hispanic population has also grown in historic districts. It is this wide range. So this kind of illusion that's a kind of common myth. Well, historic districts, that might be nice for rich white guys, but that's not, what about the rest of us? Well, that in fact, nationally is not at all what historic preservation has become. Then the issue about the environment, I know a high priority issue here in Nantucket, and it's an area that's been the most, where there's been lots of recent analysis in the connection between the environment and historic preservation. If you haven't read it, you need to. A few years ago, the National Trust established the Preservation Green Lab, and they did very good, robust research on the comparison. And their approach was, let's take 3 different building typologies in 3 or 4 different parts of the country, and let's calculate the total energy use in retrofitting historic buildings, so it's weather tight, and we need to do some stuff, or we build a green gizmo building with 42 lead stars or whatever the hell it is, and let's see that the lifetime energy expenditure on those 2 approaches. Well, what they found is that, first of all, just to recover the energy to make the damn green gizmos is going to take from 10 to 80 years, and most of those buildings ain't going to stand no 80 years, I'm telling you. And almost every building typology in every region of the country, the more environmentally responsible action was retrofitting the existing historic building. Some really smart guys in Maryland. This is a study that we did not do. An investment banker in Baltimore teamed up with an environmental economist. And their model was this. Let's say that we need a 50,000 square foot warehouse. And our choices are, okay, we can find some empty 50,000 square foot building and rehab it and use it for the warehouse, or we can go at the edge of town and build a new 50,000 square foot warehouse. And when we're done, we have a building with the same utility. What are the environmental differences between those 2 choices? Well, in vehicle miles traveled, in emission of CO2, in embodied energy in the building, and for a place that cares about outdoor stuff, I hate going outdoors, so I'm not among those. That's why I was in the library. But for people, those of you who care about that, 5 acres saved of green field. That was because of that decision that was made. Less construction debris, and that's probably a major issue in Nantucket. And infrastructure savings of between $500,000 and $800,000. I'm telling you, the Sierra Club and the Tea Party ought to be holding hands leading the preservation parade. That whether you look at it from a fiscal side or look at it from an environmental side, I'm telling you, this is the responsible reaction. So we've stolen, I'm a thief, and so we stole these guys from Maryland, their methodology, and we've begun to look at it on a single building basis. This was a building in Providence that was rehabbed. And so we said, all right, what if the guys who did this decided, all right, instead of having this building in downtown Providence, we'll have it outside using their methodology. What the difference would be, lots of differences, but many of you in this region probably know, Rhode Island has one landfill, and it's full. And it's expensive. They're trying to figure out what to do about that. Well, there's 2,000 tons of stuff that did not go into the landfill because the choice was made to rehab this building as opposed to go outside and throw it away. In New York City, before he left as mayor, Bloomberg said, I want to put New York on the path to be the greenest city in the world. And good businessman that he is, he said, well, step 1, we got to figure out where we're spending our energy, or who's using the energy. This had nothing to do with historic preservation, nothing. He just wanted to say, who is using the energy? Contrary to what we've been told for 40 years about you got to get rid of those old buildings because they're big energy hogs and blah, blah, blah. Just a lie, just a lie. What they discovered in New York is, in fact, every decade that went forward, in fact, less energy was used per square foot than the subsequent decade. It is, in fact, and if you think about the whys of that, because most of those buildings were built at a time where we didn't think we could just switch a switch and be warmer or cooler. That an architect had to design things with high ceilings so there's a place for the heat to go, with windows that picked up the sun for heat, and all kinds of decisions that were made on how the building was designed and sited, as opposed to think the whole answer was in some mechanical system. And they're paying their way for that decades later. In Utah, where we did a state study, and they happen to have a state tax credit that can be used for residential properties. The houses that used it were pretty modest in size, about 2,200 square feet, 2,100 in average. Well, every time they chose to rehab one of those buildings, houses, instead of throw it away, there was 116 tons of stuff that did not go into a landfill in Utah. I live in Washington, D.C. I love living in Washington, but Washington was a city that lost population for 50 years. So I was really curious about, and there's a number of cities in America that have had a declining population and then have turned the corner and begun to grow again. So my question was, well, when the city starts growing, where do people go? Where's the first place of return when they grow? So here is Philadelphia. Now, I don't know Philadelphia well. I go up every Tuesday in the spring and teach a class, but I walk from the train station to campus and back to the train station. But I remember the headlines in Philly at the time. We've finally turned the corner. We haven't grown much, only 8,500 people or so, but we've turned the corner. We're finally growing again. But they weren't. The historic districts in Philadelphia grew by 12,000 people. The rest of the city was still losing population. So here is the city I live in. About 46% of us live in historic districts, but turning the corner in that same thing between 2000 and 2010 is when Washington began gaining population. 46% people live in historic districts. That's where 62% of the population growth. Closer to you, Boston. Sometimes we forget that Boston declined in population too. It turned the corner a decade earlier, but with the same result. That 23% of the people in Boston live in historic districts, but that's where 36% of the growth when Boston turned the corner. So the other thing we've begun to look at is this role of historic preservation as a catalyst for other stuff. We've done it twice, once for the National Trust, looking at the historic tax credit, federal historic tax credit, and once in the state of Louisiana, looking at their state tax credit. So here's one of my favorites from the National Trust study. Here's inner city Baltimore. This project, industrial building, turned into housing. It was kind of focused on teachers and city employees. It was a great catalytic project, but what it generated is a whole change in economic activity right around it. Here's the census area in which Miller's Court exists, grew in population 8%, while the rest of the city was still losing population. Here is a firm. We work almost only for nonprofit and public entities, but once in a while we have a private sector firm, and there's a firm based in Cleveland, without trying to geek you out, that has figured out how to monetize donations of preservation easements. And they had a number of projects in close proximity in Columbia, South Carolina. And so we looked at those projects and what they did in terms of property values, in terms of population growth, in terms of rents, in terms of business activity, in terms of other investment, catalyzed additional activity. Here's my favorite example, and it's in New Orleans. And it's not one of the really cool neighborhoods in New Orleans. It's just kind of out there. And here's for those of mid-century modern people of you, here's a building that was of 1950s, 60s automobile dealership. Sat empty, guy converted it and turned into a grocery store. So here's what happened. Between Katrina and 2012, when this project took place, nothing, zip happened in this neighborhood. The project was done, and in fact, things spurred up all over. Most of it new construction, because most of it was empty lots around it, and we talked to the developers, and these are big, nice, high-rise things. Why did you do that? We did it because that guy converted that old car dealership into a grocery store, and that's become a catalyst for the whole community. Here is Baton Rouge, capital of Louisiana. They used the state tax credit to renovate a great hotel. What they had in a state capital, what they had in number of hotel rooms in downtown Baton Rouge was zero. Can you imagine that? In 2004. And now they have, I don't know how many hundreds of hotel rooms. Almost all are in rehabilitated historic buildings. All of you know this, that last year there was a salvation of the federal tax credit, the big tax law rewrite. And ultimately, for all the reasons, ultimately what convinced Congress was this, is that for every dollar that program cost the federal government, in fact, $1.18 comes back. Well, you can be a left-wing Democrat or a right-wing Republican, but programs that send back more to the federal government than they cost have got to be a good public investment, and that's really what convinced Congress in the end. But some people say, well, some people say, see, I don't know, maybe that was Congress responding, I don't know. Some people say, well, that program's been around since 1976, so haven't we done everything? Well, no. That in fact, of all of the buildings eligible, we've done maybe 18% of those. And if we never added another building to the National Register, it would take us 211 years to do all the buildings that are in fact available. So we aren't remotely done yet. Thank you all very much. I have to run to the airport to get a flight to Nashville, but we do have time for a couple questions.
Sure. Yeah. Anybody have questions? Yes.
Do you have a toolkit that we can use to evaluate our communities if we have the data?
Well, the best I can give you is that we're very transparent to kind of how we look at things, and we post all of our analyses on our site, on the Place Economics website. And so you can go on there and look at probably a dozen or 8 or 10 city studies and then a half a dozen others and look at what we did. And a lot of it, in fact, you could do on a local level. So that's the way that I do it. Yeah. One more? Question, comment, or go back to Washington, you communist. Any of those are perfectly all right. None? Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Don.